In the summer of 1925, the most remote place on Earth answered a 15-year-old boy in an attic. His name was Arthur Collins. His antenna hung from a tree behind his parents' house on Fairview Drive in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 2,500 miles north, an expedition sat frozen off the coast of Greenland, and the United States Navy, with all its power, couldn't reach them. The boy could. Night after night, on a sliver of shortwave the professionals had written off, he pulled their voices out of the Arctic and relayed them to a waiting country. That reach would become an empire. The company he built would put its radios in bombers, in broadcast towers, and eventually in the machines that carried a human voice home from the moon. And that same reach would destroy it. Because Arthur Collins saw one connection too far, a future the world wasn't ready to buy, and he bet everything to get there first. This is the story of the company that could touch anything except its own tomorrow. If you love the forgotten machinery behind American history, subscribe. This channel runs on it. Because what happened on that Iowa rooftop wasn't luck. A teenager had stumbled onto a principle, and he was about to turn it into the one thing every serious buyer would pay a premium for: certainty. The principle the boy had stumbled onto in the dark had a name, even if he didn't yet know it. Arthur Andrews Collins was born in Kingfisher, Oklahoma in 1909, and came to Cedar Rapids at the age of 7. When his father's ventures pulled the family north into Iowa, he built his first radio at 9. A crystal set wound inside an empty Quaker Oats box, the cardboard cylinder that sat in every American kitchen cupboard. It's a small detail, almost silly, and it tells you everything you need to know about the man. Before Arthur Collins ever sold a single product, he was a boy who took the ordinary objects of an ordinary Midwestern house and made them listen to the world. By 14, he had an amateur license and a call sign, 9CXX, tapped out from his parents' home. And somewhere around 1924, he fell in with a man twice his age, John Reinartz, a German-born engineer with a national reputation among radio experimenters. The two shared an obsession that most professionals dismissed as a waste of time. They were fixated on the short wavelengths, the crowded, disreputable end of the spectrum that the government had handed to amateurs precisely because the experts assumed nothing useful could survive down there. The experts were wrong. What Reinartz and Collins were chasing was a trick of the sky that would later be called skip. The way a shortwave signal, aimed just right, doesn't die at the horizon, but bounces off the ionosphere, the electrically charged layer high in the atmosphere, and comes back down to Earth hundreds or thousands of miles away. Long-wave signals, the kind the Navy trusted, crawled along the ground and faded. Shortwave leapt. And the two amateurs had worked out something the professionals hadn't, that on the 20-meter band, that leap held up even in broad daylight, when everyone assumed it should collapse. Then came the test that made the boy famous. In 1925, Reinartz shipped north as the radio operator aboard the schooner Bodwin. Carried by the National Geographic-sponsored Macmillan expedition into the ice off Greenland. The plan was to keep the explorers in contact with home, but the Navy's equipment, with its long, respectable wavelengths, kept losing them in the static. Reinartz had a partner waiting back in Iowa, a 15-year-old with a set he'd built himself. By most accounts, Collins was the only amateur in the United States who could hold a steady line to that expedition when the professionals could not. The messages he pulled out of the Arctic he passed along by telegraph to the National Geographic Society and to a country that suddenly wanted to know how a schoolboy in Cedar Rapids had beaten the United States Navy. Here is where most versions of this story stop, satisfied with the fairy tale. But the fairy tale is the least interesting part, because Arthur Collins drew a lesson from 1925 that he would spend the next 40 years selling. He understood that the achievement had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with reliability, with equipment precise enough and stable enough to do the same difficult thing every single night on demand when it mattered. The romance of radio was for hobbyists. The business of radio, Collins realized, was certainty. And certainty was something people with real money, the military, the airlines, the broadcasters, would pay a very large premium to buy. So he set out to build it. He went east to Amherst, lasted a single year, and came home to Iowa, unfinished and uninterested in a degree. What he wanted was a workbench. By most accounts, he began assembling and selling custom radio gear out of his family's home around 1931, one careful unit at a time, in the teeth of the Great Depression. The worst possible moment to start a company that sold precision to people who had no money. In 1933, he made it official and incorporated the Collins Radio Company in Cedar Rapids. It was small, hand-to-mouth, and almost invisible. It was also built on an idea nobody else was organized around. Every competitor in those years sold radios you had to coax, sets that drifted off frequency, that demanded constant fiddling, that worked beautifully in the lab and failed in the field. Collins sold the opposite. His obsession was the dial staying exactly where you put it, the signal landing exactly where it was aimed, the machine behaving the same on the 1,000th night as on the first. It was frankly boring engineering. No glamour, no showmanship, just an almost fanatical refusal to be unreliable. And it was worth a fortune, because the customers who needed radio to work when lives or money were on the line didn't care about elegance. They cared that it worked. Collins gave them a machine that always did and quietly began charging accordingly. Picture the operation in those early years, a basement in Cedar Rapids on a winter night, snow stacking against the window wells. The sharp smell of solder in the cold air. A young man bent over a hand-wired transmitter, keying it into the dark, listening for a far-off station to answer clean and steady. No drift, no fade, exactly on frequency. Upstairs, a sleeping house in a quiet Iowa town. Downstairs, a company being built one reliable connection at a time. That connection was the whole product. Not the radio, not the tubes, not the dial. The certainty that when Collins' equipment reached for something distant, it would get there and hold. It was a modest promise for a Depression-era workshop to make. Within a decade, that same promise would be strapped into warplanes over the Pacific. And within a generation, it would carry the most famous words ever spoken by a human being off the surface of another world. But first, Arthur Collins had to prove his machines could do the one thing the boy on the rooftop had learned to do: reach far and never let go, under conditions no amateur had ever faced. The conditions came, as they always do, in the form of a war. When the United States entered the Second World War, the military had a problem that Arthur Collins was almost uniquely built to solve. A combat aircraft might need a dozen different frequencies over a single mission: ground control, other planes, bases hundreds of miles apart. And a pilot fighting for his life had no free hand to hunt across a dial, nursing a drifting transmitter onto the right channel. He needed to hit a button and let the machine do the rest. Collins had already built the answer, and he called it the auto-tune, a motor-driven mechanism that swung a transmitter to any one of several preset frequencies automatically, in seconds, with no fiddling at all. It went into a compact aircraft transmitter designated the ART-13, and it changed what an airman could do. For the first time, by most accounts, a pilot could jump from one frequency to another with the flip of a switch and trust that the set would land exactly where it was told and hold there. It was Arthur Collins's boyhood obsession, the dial that stays put, turned into a weapon of war. Picture where that certainty had to live. A B-29 grinding through the black over the Pacific at 20,000 feet, engines howling, the cabin freezing. a radio operator with numb fingers reaching for the auto-tune. He doesn't lean into a receiver coaxing a signal out of the static, the way the boy in the Iowa attic once did. He turns a knob to a preset, keys the transmitter, and a base 2,000 miles away answers clean on the first call. The romance is gone. What's left is the thing Collins had been selling all along, a connection that simply works when everything around it is trying to kill you. The war remade the company. The Cedar Rapids workshop that had scraped through the Depression one hand-wired unit at a time became a genuine defense manufacturer, its floor space and payroll swelling to meet military contracts. In February 1942, Collins hired its first women production workers, and photographs from those years show long assembly lines of women building radios for the Navy. The same quiet Iowa town, now wiring the nervous system of a global war. Collins had proven his thesis at industrial scale. Reliability wasn't a hobbyist's virtue. It was a strategic asset, and the United States government would buy it by the trainload. But the true breakthrough, the one that made Collins the standard rather than merely a supplier, came after the shooting stopped. For decades, long-distance voice radio had run on ordinary AM, the same amplitude modulation that carried broadcast stations. AM was wasteful. It spent most of its power on a carrier wave that held no speech at all, and it duplicated the voice across two mirror image sidebands, doubling the bandwidth for no gain. Collins bet on a leaner idea called single sideband, SSB, which stripped away the carrier and one of those sidebands entirely, pouring all of a transmitter's power into a single slice of voice. The result was startling. The same wattage suddenly reached far more range, punched through interference, and sounded clearer at the other end. Where AM shouted and wasted its breath, SSB spoke efficiently and traveled. The catch was that single sideband was brutally hard to build well. It demanded a filter sharp enough to slice out exactly one sideband and reject everything else, and the electronic filters of the day couldn't do it cleanly. Collins' solution was characteristically physical. The mechanical filter, a sealed cylinder of tiny metal discs that vibrated in sympathy with the incoming signal, using actual mechanical resonance to carve a razor-edge slot in the spectrum that no ordinary circuit could match. It was once again precision engineering as a competitive weapon. In 1955, Collins put it all together in a matched receiver and transmitter pair, the 75A4 and the KWS-1. That Hams would nickname the Gold Dust Twins, both for their performance and for their price. The set cost well over $2,500 new, the equivalent of a small house's worth of gear, and it helped drag single sideband from an exotic experiment into the mainstream of serious radio. When the Air Force's Strategic Air Command needed to keep its nuclear bombers in contact anywhere on Earth, it turned to Collins' SSB. The company that had once relayed a schoolboy's messages out of the Arctic was now the invisible backbone of America's long-range voice, military, commercial, and civilian alike. By the mid-1950s, Arthur Collins had done something rare. He hadn't just built a better radio, he had defined what reliable meant for an entire industry, and made his name the answer. Now that name was about to conquer two enormous markets at once: the nation's broadcast towers and the bedrooms and basements of America's radio faithful. Conquering those two markets meant selling to two kinds of people who had almost nothing in common, except that both needed a machine that could not be allowed to fail. The first was the broadcaster. Starting in the mid-1930s, Collins had moved beyond communication gear into the equipment that put radio stations on the air, transmitters, and the audio mixing consoles where an engineer rode the levels of a live broadcast. It was a natural fit for a company built on certainty because a broadcast transmitter is a machine with no room for excuses. It runs for years, often around the clock, feeding a signal that thousands or millions of people are listening to at that exact moment. When it stutters, everyone hears the silence. When it drifts off frequency, it bleeds into a neighbor's channel, and the government comes calling. A station manager buying a transmitter wasn't buying elegance. He was buying the promise that the thing would still be humming, dead on frequency, at 3 in the morning 6 years from now. Which was precisely what Collins had spent 2 decades learning to sell. So Collins transmitters spread into the larger AM stations across the country and later into FM, quietly becoming part of the physical furniture of American broadcasting. Few listeners ever knew the name. That was the point. The company's reputation lived not with the audience but with the engineers, the professionals who understood that the unglamorous gray box in the transmitter shack was the best-built machine of its kind in the country and worth every dollar of its premium. The second market was the opposite of anonymous. It was the amateur, the ham radio operator in a spare bedroom or a garage, spending his own hard-earned money to reach strangers on the far side of the planet for the sheer wonder of it. And here, Collins became something more than a supplier. It became an object of desire. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Collins built a line of amateur equipment so refined it approached art. The S-line, a matched receiver and transmitter, the 75S1 and the 32S1, in slim, elegant cabinets, set a standard for how a radio should look and feel as much as how it should perform. Then came the KWM2, billed as the first amateur mobile single sideband transceiver, compact enough to ride in a car, yet built to Collins' uncompromising standard. Collectors still speak of the badges on these radios the way others speak of vintage watches, the winged emblem, the round emblem, small metal insignia that told you which era of the company's obsession you were holding. And you paid for it. Collins' amateur gear was priced like the luxury good it was. A ham could assemble a competitor's entire station for the cost of a single Collins piece. But those who bought it were buying membership in a kind of aristocracy of reliability. The knowledge that when the atmosphere turned hostile and the band went noisy and everyone else was struggling, their equipment would still be pulling clean signals out of the chaos. It was the boy in the Iowa attic, sold by the unit to a nation of enthusiasts who wanted for a few hours a night to reach as far as he once had. Beneath all of it, the company was enormous. By the 1960s, Collins employed more than 20,000 engineers, scientists, and workers, and poured roughly a fifth of its entire effort into research and development, an extraordinary share for any manufacturer, and a quiet clue to how this story ends. A company that spends 20% of itself chasing the future is a company running very hot. Cedar Rapids had become, in effect, a company town, its identity fused with the firm that had grown out of one teenager's basement. And in a corner of that vast research effort, something strange was taking shape. Something that had nothing to do with radios at all. As early as the 1950s, Collins had begun building devices to send digital data over ordinary communication channels, using a technique it called kineplex. It was an odd thing for a radio company to care about. Not voice, not music, but raw information, machines talking to machines. Almost no one outside the company understood why Arthur Collins found it so important. He had convinced himself of a heretical idea, that computers and communications were not two separate industries at all, but one system waiting to be built. For now it was a small, expensive curiosity, humming away in the background, while the money rolled in from transmitters and ham rigs. Remember it. It matters later. Picture the empire at its height. A broadcast control room somewhere in America, a Collins console glowing under the studio lights, VU meters twitching as an engineer eases a fader up and the station lifts into the evening air. Carried from microphone to antenna on machinery from a small city in Iowa that most of the listeners had never heard of. That machinery was about to leave the ground entirely. When the machinery left the ground, it went farther than anyone in that Iowa basement could have dreamed. because the same problem that had defined Collins from the beginning turned out to be the central problem of spaceflight. How do you keep a human voice connected across an impossible distance reliably when a single dropout could mean a life? It was the Arctic question again, and the Strategic Air Command question again, only now the distance wasn't 2,500 miles or 2,000. It was hundreds of thousands. And once more, the answer came out of Cedar Rapids. In 1958, as the United States assembled its first human spaceflight program, the McDonnell Company chose Collins to furnish the communication system for Project Mercury, the compact, high-reliability gear that would carry voice, telemetry, and tracking signals for the first Americans in space. When Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and Gordon Cooper rode their capsules into the sky, the equipment that linked them to the ground traced back to Arthur Collins's 40-year obsession with a connection that holds. Mercury led to Gemini, and Gemini raised the stakes. Now there were two men in the spacecraft, longer missions, rendezvous, and docking to coordinate. Collins designed and built the voice communication system for the program, and by the company's account, it performed on all 10 crewed Gemini flights. The boy who had beaten the Navy with a homemade set now had his engineering strapped into every American spacecraft that carried a human being. Then came Apollo, and the problem changed shape. The earlier programs had used separate radio systems for voice, for telemetry, for tracking, a tangle of links that grew unwieldy as the missions reached toward the moon. The solution was an elegant consolidation called Unified S-band, a single microwave system operating in the S-band range that braided everything together: two-way voice, telemetry data, distance ranging, and even the downlink television, into one transmission path between the spacecraft and the Earth. It was a masterpiece of doing more with less, and it was exactly the kind of problem Collins had spent its life solving. Here, precision matters, and not just in the engineering. The popular story says that Collins' radio was the voice of Apollo, that every word from the moon came home through Collins alone. The truth is more crowded and, in its way, more interesting. The unified S-band effort drew on several contractors, Collins among them, alongside firms like Motorola and others who built pieces of the spacecraft transponders. What Collins specifically owned was enormous in its own right. The company was the prime contractor to NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center for the worldwide network of unified S-band ground stations, the great dish antennas and the electronics inside them that reached up, locked onto a capsule 250,000 miles away, and pulled its signal down. Collins didn't just build boxes, it built and installed the ears of the Apollo program across the surface of the planet. The high water mark came in December 1968 when Apollo 8 carried the first humans around the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders spoke and sent live television from 240,000 miles out, and millions of people on Earth marveled not just at the pictures, but at how astonishingly clear they were. A voice from lunar orbit, arriving in American living rooms without a hiss. That clarity was the whole thesis of the company made audible. Every promise Arthur Collins had ever sold, the dial that stays put, the connection that never lets go, was now being kept across the emptiness between two worlds. The astronauts knew where it came from. Men from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs made the trip to Cedar Rapids, to the plant in the middle of Iowa, to see for themselves the communication gear they were trusting with their lives. Picture that. The most famous test pilots in the world, the men whose faces filled every newspaper, walking an assembly floor in a quiet Midwestern town, shaking hands with the people wiring the radios that would speak for them in space. And picture the far end of that connection, a tracking station somewhere in the remote Australian outback, Past midnight, red dust, and hard stars, a great steel dish turning slowly against the sky. Inside, a technician sits with his hand on the tracker that guides the antenna, holding it locked on a moving point of light no bigger than a spark. A spacecraft, and the men inside it, whose voices are landing in that room before they reach the rest of the world. The silence of the outback, the hum of the electronics, and a signal, threaded through Collins-built machinery, carrying a human being home. This was the summit. In a little over 3 decades, Arthur Collins had taken a teenager's rooftop antenna and turned it into the voice of the space age. A Fortune 500 company whose reach quite literally could not be exceeded, because there was nowhere farther to go than the moon. Which is exactly the problem with summits. There is only one direction left, and the programs that had carried Collins to the top of the world were about to start winding down, just as Arthur Collins reached for the one connection that lay beyond even the moon. The connection beyond the moon had a name too, and Arthur Collins had been quietly building toward it for years. But before we get to what he reached for, we have to understand what was happening beneath his feet. Because the ground that had held the company up for 3 decades was giving way on 2 sides at once. Start with the money. For most of its life, Collins had rested on 2 enormous pillars of demand, and by the end of the 1960s, both were cracking. The first was defense. The Cold War and then the war in Vietnam had poured military contracts into Cedar Rapids for years. Radios for aircraft, for ships, for the whole apparatus of a nation on permanent alert. But as the United States began to de-escalate in Vietnam, that flood slowed to a trickle. Contracts that had been renewed like clockwork simply ended, and a company built to supply a wartime military found the war going away. The second pillar was space itself. The very triumph we just watched, Apollo, the moon, the summit, was, in business terms, a peak that could only be descended. Once the United States had proven it could put men on the lunar surface, the political urgency drained out of the space program, and the budgets followed. The market for the exotic space and avionics technology that Collins had raced to build began to shrink almost as fast as it had grown. The 2 great customers that had defined the company's golden age, the Pentagon and NASA, were both, at the same moment, closing their wallets. A disciplined company might have weathered that. Markets contract, strong firms trim, wait, and survive the cycle. But Collins was not, at that moment, positioned to wait, because Arthur Collins had made a decision that would turn a survivable downturn into an existential crisis. He had bet the company on the future, and the future wasn't ready to pay. That bet was the C system. Remember Kineplex, the odd little data experiment humming in the background of the company's golden years? The machines built to talk to machines? That had been the seed. Beginning in the mid-1960s, Arthur Collins committed a significant share of his company's time and resources to its full flowering, a completely integrated system he described as communication, computation, and control, an attempt to fuse computers and communications into a single architecture that could combine all the major functions of an enterprise into one workable whole. He was no longer selling radios. He was trying to build the nervous system of the modern organization, a decade before the world had a word for it. And here's the tragedy embedded in the vision. He was right. Arthur Collins had seen, with genuine clarity, that computers and communications were not 2 industries, but one. That information itself would someday flow through networks, the way voice flowed through his radios. It is very nearly a description of the world you live in now. He simply saw it too early. The C system was a machine built for a marketplace that did not yet exist. The customers who would one day pay fortunes for networked computing were, in the late 1960s, not born yet as buyers. Collins was manufacturing the answer to a question almost no one was asking. You can see the shape of the problem in a single statistic from the company's own catalogs. By the 1960s, Collins was pouring roughly 20% of its entire effort into research and development, a fifth of everything the company was. Its people, its money, its energy, aimed not at what customers wanted today, but at what Arthur Collins was certain they would need tomorrow. In a rising market, that kind of spending is visionary. In a market where your two biggest customers are simultaneously walking away, it is a fire burning through the balance sheet with nothing coming in to replace what it consumes. This is the real mechanism of the fall, and it has nothing to do with a genius losing his touch. It is a matter of timing and cash. A company can survive a collapse in revenue if it isn't also spending itself dry chasing a future that hasn't arrived. A company can survive an expensive moonshot if its core business is still throwing off cash. Collins was doing both at once, and the two failures fed each other. The shrinking defense and space contracts meant less money coming in, exactly as the sea system demanded more money going out. The vision that should have been the company's next great act became instead an anchor chained to it as the water rose. Picture the Cedar Rapids research labs late in the decade, a room full of the future, reel-to-reel tape drives spinning in tall cabinets, engineers moving between machines that could send data across distances, sketching an architecture for a networked world that wouldn't fully exist for 30 years. It should have been the beginning of everything. Every light in that room was on. And somewhere in the accounting offices down the hall, someone was starting to understand that the company might not survive long enough to be proven right. Because the bills were coming due, and the men who held the debt were about to decide that Arthur Collins had reached one connection too far. The men who held the debt did not care about the future Arthur Collins could see. They cared about the numbers on the page in front of them, and by the early 1970s, those numbers had turned frightening. The losses were mounting. A company that had been a byword for engineering excellence was now, in plain financial terms, hemorrhaging money. The twin squeeze of collapsing contracts and the sea system's appetite finally showing up in red ink that no reputation could paper over. By most accounts, Collins was posting losses in the neighborhood of $10 to $17 million, depending on which year and whose ledger you read. And it was doing so while carrying the debt of its enormous research bet. A firm in that condition has only a few doors left, and most of them lead to the same place. Someone with capital walks in, and the founder walks out. The someone was North American Rockwell, soon to be renamed Rockwell International, a sprawling aerospace and industrial conglomerate with exactly the kind of balance sheet Collins no longer had. Beginning in 1971, Rockwell moved, investing heavily enough to take a controlling interest in the company, and control, in this story, meant precisely what it always means. Rockwell had not bought into Collins to admire Arthur Collins' vision of a networked world. It had bought in to stop the bleeding. So they removed him. In November 1971, the Rockwell-controlled board of directors stripped Arthur Collins of his positions as president and chairman of the company that carried his name, the company he had built from a basement, the company that was, in every sense that mattered, him. On December 7, 1971, he formally resigned. 40 years, almost to the season, after a teenager had incorporated a tiny radio firm in Cedar Rapids, its founder was escorted out of it by the men who now owned his debt. And then comes the cruelest part of the whole story, the twist that turns a business failure into something closer to tragedy. The company was saved almost immediately. With Collins gone, the new management did the ruthless, unglamorous work that a founder in love with his vision could never quite bring himself to do. They turned away from the sea system, throttling back the immense commitment that had been draining the company toward the future. They imposed strict financial controls. They restructured the divisions, pushed harder into overseas markets, and cut the company down to something that could live within its means. It was not visionary work, it was survival, done with a cold hand. And it worked with startling speed. Within about a year, we spake out. About a year, the bleeding stopped and reversed. By most accounts, the company swung from a loss on the order of $17 million in 1972 to a profit of roughly $3 million by 1973. Some sources put the figures differently, but every version tells the same story: a fast, decisive turnaround. The patient, in other words, recovered almost the moment the founder was wheeled out of the room. Everything Arthur Collins' successors did to save the company was work that proved the company was savable. He simply wasn't there to be credited with it. And in the middle of that recovery, Rockwell closed its hand the rest of the way. Having taken control, stabilized the finances, and watched the company return to profit, the conglomerate moved to absorb Collins entirely. In October 1973, the Collins board approved a full merger into Rockwell International. The shareholders ratified it on November 2, 1973. On that date, the Collins Radio Company ceased to exist as an independent enterprise. Name would live on, bolted to a larger corporate identity, but the thing itself, the independent firm that had grown out of one man's obsession with a connection that holds, was gone. It had been swallowed at the precise moment it proved it deserved to survive. Sit with the timing, because the timing is the whole point. Arthur Collins was not removed because his company was doomed. He was removed because his company was worth saving, and the people with the capital to save it wanted it for themselves. The turnaround that vindicated the enterprise happened without him and enriched the men who had pushed him out. He had made one bet too many at exactly the wrong moment in the business cycle, and the reward for the recovery went to the acquirer, as it so often does. Picture the assembly floor in Cedar Rapids on the day the merger was announced. The lines are still running, radios still being wired, transmitters still being tested, the ordinary work of a company that still makes excellent machines. But the name on the building is changing, and everyone on that floor knows it. The founder who had walked those aisles, who had shaken the astronauts' hands right there, is gone to Texas. The company will go on. It will even thrive. It just won't be his anymore. He wasn't finished, though. Arthur Collins would chase his impossible connection one more time. And what happened to that final attempt, and what the world eventually did with his idea, is the part of this story almost no one knows. The part almost no one knows begins in Dallas, with a man starting over. After his ouster, Arthur Collins did not retire into silence. He founded a new firm, Arthur A. Collins, Inc., and set it to work on exactly the vision that had cost him his company: large-scale systems that would weave computing and communications together, the same heretical idea he had been chasing since Kineplex. He had been proven right about everything except the timing, and he seemed determined to be proven right again. But the second act never came. The new company patented a few ideas and sold almost nothing. It shrank year by year until it had dwindled to almost nothing at all. When Arthur Collins died in 1987 following a stroke, the firm that bore his full name was a shadow, and the man who had put the voice of the space age on the air held 27 U.S. patents and a reputation that had quietly slipped out of public memory. He did not live to see the vindication. And the vindication is the thing that makes this story ache. Because the marriage of computers and communications that Arthur Collins bet his company on, the future the world wasn't ready to buy in 1968, arrived. And the company he had lost helped build it. In the 1970s, now operating under the Rockwell name, the old Collins organization put its radio expertise to work on something called packet radio, a way of breaking communication into small digital packets, sending them through the air and reassembling them at the far end. Working alongside researchers at the Stanford Research Institute, Collins engineers built the experimental packet radios for one of the first such networks, And in 1977, that network took part in a landmark demonstration. 3 separate networks stitched together and made to pass data as one. Historians of technology point to that moment as one of the true foundation stones of the modern internet. Be careful with that claim, because it is easy to overstate, and the truth is remarkable enough without inflation. Collins did not invent the internet, but the company that Arthur Collins built, using the exact fusion of computers and communications he had insisted on for 20 years, helped lay one of its cornerstones. A decade after that same insistence had gotten him fired for pursuing it too soon. He was right. He was so completely right that his own company proved it. He just wasn't there, and it wasn't his anymore, and history handed the credit to other names. That is the founder's legacy. But there is another one, humbler and more literal, and it was hiding in this story all along. Remember the transmitters? The unglamorous gray boxes in the broadcast shacks, the machines Collins built to run for years without stopping. They did exactly that. Long after the Collins Radio Company had vanished into Rockwell, its transmitters kept humming in AM and FM stations across the United States, carrying voices and music to people who had no idea what name was on the equipment. When Collins itself finally stepped back from the broadcast business, the transmitter line was sold onto another firm, Continental Electronics, which kept building Collins' own designs under a different nameplate into the 1980s. The machines outlived the company. The certainty Arthur Collins had sold turned out to be so durable that it went right on working after the man, the company, and even the brand had all faded away. Anonymous, reliable, still on the air. And in a different corner of America, his other legacy sits polished and adored. The S-line receivers, the KWM2 transceivers, the Gold Dust Twins, the amateur gear that once cost a small fortune, are now treasured relics, restored and traded and switched on by collectors who speak of them with something like reverence. The winged emblem and the round emblem, those little metal badges, have become objects of devotion. A machine built for certainty became, in the end, a thing built for love. So consider what one teenager's obsession finally amounted to. A company that put its radios in warplanes and broadcast towers and Apollo spacecraft. A founder who saw the networked world so clearly it destroyed him, and whose company helped build that world without him. Transmitters still faithfully on the air, unattributed, and a shelf of gleaming radios that people cherish precisely because they never let anyone down. Now go back to where it started. A house on Fairview Drive in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. An attic window, an antenna strung out to a tree, and a 15-year-old boy in the dark reaching across 2,500 miles of frozen nothing to pull a voice out of the Arctic when the United States Navy could not. Everything came from that room. The empire, the moon, the Vindication, the ruin. The whole story is already there, in a boy who simply could not stand to let a connection drop. Arthur Collins spent his life reaching farther than the world was ready for. He touched the Arctic and the moon, and the edge of a networked age no one else could yet see. He could connect anything, it turned out, except his own company to a future that arrived just a little too late to save it. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There's another forgotten machine and another American story waiting in the next one. See you in the next one.